Eshe was just 6 years old when her world changed forever. She had always known love, warmth, and the gentle touch of her mother, who would braid her hair under the shade of the great baobab tree. But one morning, the sun rose without its usual warmth. Her mother had fallen ill, and before the moon could complete another cycle, she was gone. The village mourned, but no one mourned like Eshe. Her father, Chief Bahari, was a strong man, respected by all. He held his daughter close, promising to protect her, but even the strongest men cannot heal a broken heart. Days turned to weeks, and the once lively house grew silent, filled only with echoes of what used to be. Eshe clung to her father, fearing that if she let go, she would lose him too. Then one day, Bahari returned from a journey with a woman by his side. She was tall and beautiful, dressed in fine cloth, her smile warm and reassuring. "This is Nabinti," Bahari told Eshe. "She will be your new mother." Eshe wanted to be happy. She wanted to believe that this woman would bring back the laughter that had left their home. At first, Nabinti was kind, speaking in soft tones and holding Eshe's hand as they walked through the village. She made sure everyone saw how much she cared. "You are my daughter now," she would say, brushing Eshe's cheek with feigned tenderness. But behind closed doors, her kindness faded. The moment Bahari was out of sight, Nabinti's gaze hardened. She no longer smiled at Eshe, no longer held her hand. Instead, she watched her with cold, calculating eyes. "You are not special," she whispered one night when Bahari was away. "You are just a burden." Eshe didn't understand. How could someone who had been so kind suddenly become so distant? She tried to be good, to do everything Nabinti asked, but nothing was ever enough. And when Eshe looked into Nabinti's eyes, she saw something she had never seen before: hatred. The day Chief Bahari left for trade was the day Eshe's world turned into a nightmare. He kissed her forehead before he rode off with his men, promising to bring her gifts upon his return. She held on to his words, believing they meant safety, believing that as long as her father loved her, nothing bad could happen. But the moment Bahari disappeared beyond the horizon, Nabinti's sweet smile faded like dust in the wind. Her voice, once soft and gentle, turned sharp and cold. "Enough with those foolish eyes, Eshe," she snapped. "You are not a princess here." Eshe blinked in confusion. She had never thought of herself as a princess, only as a daughter who had lost her mother and wished to be loved again. But Nabinti had already turned away, calling for her own daughter, Zalira. Zalira was nothing like Eshe. Where Eshe was quiet and careful, Zalira was loud and demanding. She walked with a sense of entitlement, her every whim granted by Nabinti. That first night, Eshe was told she would no longer sleep in her soft bed, but on a thin mat near the kitchen. "A girl like you does not need comfort," Nabinti said, her eyes cold. "Only hard work will teach you your place." At first, Eshe did not understand. Surely this was some mistake. Surely her father would never allow this. But as the days passed, the cruelty only grew. The house, once filled with warmth, became a prison. Nabinti's voice followed her everywhere, barking orders. "Fetch water! Clean the floors! Wash Zalira's feet!" There was no rest, no kindness. Zalira, once a girl Eshe had hoped to befriend, took pleasure in her suffering. She laughed when Eshe tripped under the weight of heavy water pots. She sneered when Eshe's hands turned raw from scrubbing the floors. "Look at her, mother," she would say, pointing. "She's just a little servant girl now." And Nabinti would smile, pleased. "Yes, my child," she would agree. "That is all she is." Eshe learned to stay quiet, to hold back her tears. Crying only made Zalira laugh harder. Complaining only made Nabinti angrier. She tried to remind herself that her father would return, that he would put an end to this. But as the days stretched into weeks, doubt crept in. What if he never saw the truth? What if he believed Nabinti's lies? And worst of all, what if this was her life now? It was a hot afternoon, and Eshe's arms ached from carrying heavy jugs of water from the well. She had been up before sunrise, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and making food for Nabinti and Zalira. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she struggled to balance the clay jug on her head, her small feet kicking up dust as she hurried back to the house. She knew if she was too slow, Nabinti would punish her. But just as she reached the doorway, her tired arms failed her. The jug slipped. Time seemed to slow as it tumbled from her grasp, crashing onto the hard ground. The sound of shattering clay echoed through the house. Water splashed everywhere, soaking Eshe's legs. She gasped, her heart pounding in terror. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other room, came the slow, deliberate footsteps of Nabinti. Eshe's hands trembled as she dropped to her knees, trying to scoop up the broken pieces, but it was useless. The water had already seeped into the dirt, and the jug was in shards. Nabinti appeared in the doorway, her face a storm of fury. Behind her, Zalira smirked, already sensing the entertainment that was about to unfold. "You foolish girl." Nabinti's voice was sharp like a blade. "Do you know how expensive that jug was?" I'm sorry, mother," Eshe stammered, keeping her head down, hoping her apology would soften Nabinti's wrath. "Sorry," Nabinti hissed. "Sorry will not bring back my jug." Before Eshe could react, Nabinti grabbed her wrist and dragged her across the courtyard. The woman's grip was iron, her nails digging into Eshe's delicate skin. Eshe knew there was no escape. She was thrown to the ground near the broken pieces. The sharp edges of the clay glinted in the sunlight like tiny knives. Eshe's breath caught in her throat. "You break it. You pay for it," Nabinti said, her voice eerily calm now. "Take off your shoes." Eshe's eyes widened in horror. "Please, no." But Zalira laughed. "Do it," she taunted. "Or do you want me to help you?" Eshe knew it wouldn't matter what she said. If she refused, Zalira would only make it worse. Slowly, her trembling hands reached down, slipping off her worn-out shoes. Her bare feet touched the hot, dry ground. "Now," Nabinti said, her eyes cold and merciless. "Walk." Eshe hesitated. Her heart pounded. The sharp pieces of the jug lay in front of her like a trap waiting to snap shut. "Walk!" Nabinti shouted. With tears in her eyes, Eshe took a deep breath and stepped forward. The first shard sliced into her soft skin like fire. A gasp escaped her lips, but she forced herself to take another step. The pain was unbearable, like 1,000 needles stabbing into her flesh. Warm blood pooled beneath her feet, staining the broken clay red. Zalira clapped her hands in delight. "Look at her!" she laughed. "She's dancing!" Eshe bit her lip to keep from crying out. She couldn't give them the satisfaction. Step by step, she moved forward, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her body. The world blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Nabinti watched with cruel satisfaction. "That should teach you to be more careful," she said. When Eshe finally reached the other side of the courtyard, her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the ground. Her feet were in shreds, the cuts deep and oozing. She had never known pain like this. But even as she lay there broken and bleeding, something inside her hardened. She would never forget this moment. She would never forget this pain. And one day, Nabinti and Zalira would pay for every tear she had shed. That night, Eshe lay curled on the cold, hard floor near the kitchen, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain. Every time she moved, a fresh sting shot through her feet. The wounds were deep, still raw, and she could feel the dried blood cracking against her skin. But she didn't cry. She had already learned that tears meant nothing in this house. The night was silent, except for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. The rest of the household was asleep. Nabinti snoring in her luxurious bed, Zalira dreaming of her next cruel trick. Eshe closed her eyes, trying to drift into unconsciousness, hoping sleep would take her away from the pain. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps, careful, measured. They stopped near her, and for a moment she thought she was imagining things. But then a gentle hand touched her shoulder. "Little one," a warm, familiar voice whispered. "Wake up." Eshe's eyes fluttered open, and in the dim light of the moon, she saw her. Mama Jovia, the old healer who had lived in the village longer than anyone could remember. Her face was lined with age, her eyes wise and filled with something Eshe had not seen in a long time. Kindness. "You are hurt," Mama Jovia said softly, glancing down at Eshe's bloodied feet. "Let me help you." Eshe hesitated. If Nabinti found out, there would be more punishment. But before she could protest, Mama Jovia was already moving, lifting her ever so gently, her touch softer than anything Eshe had felt in years. The old woman carried her out into the night beyond the house, to a quiet corner near the trees. She set Eshe down and pulled a small pouch from the folds of her shawl. From it, she took out herbs, crushed them in her hands, and mixed them with water from a small clay bowl. The scent of the herbs was strong, earthy, but soothing. "This will sting, child," Mama Jovia warned. Eshe nodded, bracing herself. She had already endured worse pain than this. When the healer pressed the paste onto her wounds, a sharp burn shot through her, but it quickly faded into a cool relief. As Mama Jovia worked, she hummed softly. an old tune that Eshe had heard long ago, one her own mother used to sing. It made her chest tighten with emotions she had tried to bury. When the healer finished, she wrapped Eshe's feet in soft cloth, far gentler than the rough rags Nabinti had ever given her. Then she sat back, studying Eshe with knowing eyes. "You are stronger than you know, child," Mama Jovia said quietly. "Fate has a plan for you." Eshe lowered her gaze. "I don't think fate cares about me," she whispered. Mama Jovia reached out, lifting Eshe's chin so their eyes met. "You are wrong," she said firmly. "The trials you endure now are shaping you for something greater. Pain is not the end of your story, Eshe. It is only the beginning." Eshe swallowed hard. Could she believe that? Could she dare to hope? The healer smiled gently, brushing a stray curl from Eshe's face. "One day, child, you will rise. And when you do, those who have hurt you will tremble." Eshe held on to those words, letting them settle deep into her heart. She did not know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something she thought she had lost forever: hope. The sun rose over the village, casting golden light across the land. A restless excitement filled the air. Chief Bahari was returning after months of travel. Servants rushed to prepare his favorite meals, and villagers gathered near the gates, eager to welcome their leader. But inside the house, Eshe sat quietly in a corner, wrapping fresh bandages around her wounded feet. The pain was still there, a constant reminder of Nabinti's cruelty, but she had learned to endure it. Zalaira paced back and forth, adjusting the fine beads in her hair, making sure she looked perfect. "Father will bring me gifts," she boasted. "Beautiful dresses, gold bracelets, maybe even rare silk." She shot a smirking glance at Eshe. "And you, little servant, will get nothing." Eshe said nothing. She had learned that silence was her shield. No matter how cruel Zalaira's words were, she would not let them break her. Then, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Cheers erupted from outside. Bahari had arrived. Nabinti's face transformed into a mask of warmth and joy as she rushed out to meet her husband. She played the role of the perfect wife, the loving mother, while behind the walls of this house, her heart was nothing but stone. When Bahari stepped down from his horse, he looked weary but happy. His eyes searched the crowd, and when they landed on Eshe, they softened. "My little Eshe," he said, opening his arms. "Come here, my child." For a brief moment, hope flickered in Eshe's heart. Maybe, just maybe, she could tell him everything. Maybe he would see the truth, see the bruises, the pain in her eyes. But before she could move, Nabinti placed a firm hand on Bahari's arm and let out a deep sigh. "My husband, I must tell you something about Eshe." Her voice was filled with false concern. Bahari frowned. "What is it?" Nabinti lowered her gaze as if she were ashamed to speak. She has changed," she whispered. "Since you left, she's been rebellious. She refuses to listen, disrespects me, and does as she pleases. I tried to guide her, but she does not want to be guided." Eshe's heart clenched. It was a lie, a terrible, wicked lie. But what could she do? If she spoke out, Nabinti would punish her even more when Bahari left again. Bahari turned to Eshe, his once loving eyes now clouded with disappointment. "Is this true?" he asked. Eshe lowered her head. She wanted to scream the truth, to beg him to look deeper, to see the pain she carried. But Mama Jovia's words echoed in her mind. "Pain is not the end of your story. It is only the beginning." So she remained silent. Her silence only seemed to confirm Nabinti's lie. Bahari let out a deep sigh. "Eshe, I did not expect this from you," he said. "Your mother would have wanted better." The words cut deeper than any wound. Her mother. If she were alive, none of this would have happened. But she was gone, and Eshe was alone, in a world that only seemed to grow darker. Zalaira grinned, pleased to see Eshe take the blame. Nabinti, satisfied with her deception, placed a hand on Bahari's shoulder. "Do not worry, my love. I will handle her." Bahari nodded. "I trust you, Nabinti." Eshe felt her heart sink. He trusted the very woman who was destroying her. As the celebrations continued, gifts were given, laughter filled the air, and Bahari embraced his family. But Eshe remained in the shadows, unseen and unheard, carrying her suffering in silence. And as she watched Nabinti smile at Bahari, acting as if she were a devoted wife, Eshe made a silent promise to herself. One day, the truth would come out. One day, she would no longer be the girl who suffered in silence. The village was buzzing with excitement. A traveler had arrived, a man known in distant lands for his wisdom, Elder Omari. He was old, his hair silver like the moon, his face lined with years of knowledge. He had seen many things, walked many roads, and spoken with kings and beggars alike. People gathered around him, eager to hear his stories, to seek his advice. Chief Bahari welcomed him warmly, offering him the best seat in the courtyard. Nabinti, always eager to impress, brought the finest food, her smile wide as she tried to show herself as a perfect hostess. Zalira sat beside her mother, dressed in her best, hoping to catch the elder's attention. Eshe stood in the shadows, watching silently. She knew better than to step forward. She was nothing but a servant in her own home. But as she turned to leave, she felt a gaze upon her. Elder Omari was looking directly at her. His eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to see through the walls she had built around herself. Eshe lowered her head, not wanting to be noticed, but it was too late. The elder rose from his seat and walked towards her. The crowd hushed, watching with curiosity. "You," he said, his voice calm yet powerful. "What is your name, child?" Eshe hesitated, then answered softly, "Eshe." Omari studied her, his sharp eyes taking in everything. The bruises on her arms, the stiffness in her steps, the sadness buried deep within her gaze. He nodded, as if confirming something only he understood. "You carry great pain," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "But within that pain there is strength." A murmur spread through the crowd. Nabinti stiffened, her grip tightening around Zalira's arm. Bahari frowned, confused. "Elder, what do you mean?" Omari did not look away from Eshe. "This girl," he said, "has the heart of a lion. She endures silently, but the fire inside her has not gone out. One day, that fire will rise, and when it does, the world will remember her name." Eshe's heart pounded. No one had ever spoken of her like this. No one had ever seen her, truly seen her. Nabinti let out a forced laugh. "Elder, you must be mistaken. She is just a quiet child. There is nothing special about her." Omari turned his gaze to Nabinti, and for the first time, she faltered under his stare. "Many do not see the value of a diamond when it is still covered in dust," he said, "but that does not change what it is." Bahari looked between Omari and Eshe, his mind struggling to understand. He had always loved his daughter, but after hearing Nabinti's words over and over, he had begun to doubt her. Now, an outsider, a wise elder, was telling him something different. Eshe remained silent, but inside her, something shifted. For the first time in years, she felt hope. Elder Omari turned back to her, his voice softer now. "Do not let the darkness around you put out your light, child. The strongest souls are forged in the hottest fires." With that, he stepped away, leaving behind a stunned silence. Nabinti forced a smile, quickly changing the subject, laughing loudly to distract Bahari. But deep inside, she felt something she had never felt before when looking at Eshe: fear. Eshe, still standing in the same spot, felt a strange warmth in her chest. She did not understand everything Omari had said, but she held on to his words, because for the first time, someone had told her what she had never dared to believe. She was not weak, she was not nothing, she was something greater than she knew. Eshe sat under the old mango tree, her bandaged feet resting on a soft cloth. The pain still lingered, but it was different now. Not just pain, but a reminder that she had survived, that she was still here. Mama Jovia knelt beside her, carefully rubbing healing herbs into her wounds. The old healer's hands were rough but gentle, her eyes filled with a wisdom that spoke louder than words. "You are stronger than you think, my child," Mama Jovia whispered, as she wrapped fresh leaves around Eshe's feet. "Pain may try to break you, but it can also make you rise." Eshe listened, but she did not believe it yet. How could she? Her whole life had been filled with suffering. Every time she had dared to hope, Nabinti had crushed it beneath her cruel hands. But then, Elder Omari arrived. He did not speak much at first. He simply watched, observed, and then, one evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, he called Eshe forward. "Walk," he said. Eshe looked at him in disbelief. "I cannot." Omari shook his head. "You mean you have not tried?" Her heart pounded. Did he not see how broken she was? Did he not know the agony that shot through her feet with every step? But Omari was patient. "Pain is not your enemy, Eshe," he said. "Fear is." She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but something in his voice, something in his eyes, made her hesitate. So she tried. She pressed her hands against the ground, trembling as she pushed herself up. The first step was unbearable. Fire burned through her feet. Her legs shook, and for a moment, she thought she would collapse. But Omari did not let her fall. "Again," he said. So she tried again. Day after day, Mama Jovia's herbs soothed her wounds, and Omari's lessons pushed her beyond what she thought was possible. He taught her not just to walk, but to move with purpose. He made her stretch, strengthen her body, and steady her mind. "You are not weak, Eshe," he told her one night as they sat by the fire. "You have simply never been given the chance to see your own strength." Slowly, something inside her began to change. With each painful step, she felt less like the helpless girl Nabinti had crushed beneath her cruelty, and more like something else, someone stronger. Then, one evening, it happened. Omari stood before her, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. "Walk to me," he said. Eshe hesitated. She looked down at her feet, remembering the broken glass, the blood, the humiliation. But then she looked at Omari, at Mama Jovia, at the fire in their eyes. She took a step, and another, and another. By the time she reached Omari, tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were something else, something warm, something powerful. Omari placed a hand on her shoulder. "The world tried to break you," he said, "but look at you now." For the first time in her life, Eshe believed it. She was not weak, she was not broken, she was rising. The village was alive with excitement. Drums echoed through the air. Children ran barefoot through the dusty paths, and the smell of roasted meat filled every corner. It was the day of the grand festival, the most awaited event of the year. People from neighboring villages had gathered to watch the competitions, tests of strength, skill, and endurance. The best of the best would rise, and the weak would fade into the background. For years, Eshe had been in that background, a girl meant to serve, to suffer, to be forgotten. But not today. When her name was called, the crowd fell silent. The villagers turned, eyes widening in disbelief. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did they say Eshe, the crippled girl? Is this a joke? Even Nabinti, dressed in her finest beads, nearly choked on her drink. Zalira, her daughter, scoffed. "She won't last a second," she muttered, folding her arms. Eshe, however, did not hear them. She did not care. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Her feet, once raw and bloodied, now stood firm on the ground. She had trained for this moment, fought through pain, and conquered fear. She was ready. The first test was balance. A narrow wooden beam stretched over a pit of water. One by one, the competitors walked across, swift and steady. When Eshe's turn came, the crowd held its breath. "She will fall," someone whispered, but she didn't. Step by step, she moved with grace and control. The same girl who had once crawled in pain now stood tall, her body steady as a mountain. She reached the end, leapt off, and landed without a stumble. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nabinti's face darkened. The second challenge was speed, a race through the village, over logs, under ropes, past hurdles, meant to test endurance. Eshe lined up beside Zalira and the strongest competitors. The drum sounded, and they ran. Zalira dashed ahead, confident as ever. She had always been the one in the spotlight, the one praised, the one showered with love. But today was different. Behind her, Eshe ran like the wind. She did not just run with her legs. She ran with her heart, with her pain, with the strength she had built in the shadows. One by one, she passed her opponents. The crowd roared. And then, she passed Zalira. Zalira's eyes widened in shock, her legs burning with exhaustion. But Eshe was unstoppable. She crossed the finish line first, her chest heaving, her body trembling, not with weakness, but with power. The final challenge was strength. A heavy stone, larger than a man's head, had to be lifted and carried a few steps. The strongest warriors had struggled, their muscles straining. Zalira did not even try. "This is impossible," she muttered. But Eshe stepped forward. A murmur spread through the crowd. "She won't be able to do it. She is just a girl." But Eshe crouched, took a deep breath, and placed her hands on the stone. She closed her eyes, remembering the nights of pain, the days of struggle, the weight of Nabinti's cruelty pressing down on her for years. And then she lifted. The stone rose from the ground, her arms shaking, her legs burning, but she did not stop. She took one step, then another, and then she dropped it, right in front of the judges. Silence, then cheers. The entire village erupted. People clapped, shouted, and chanted her name. "Eshe! Eshe! Eshe!" She had done it. For the first time, she was not invisible. For the first time, She was not weak. She had not just entered the competition. She had won the respect of the entire village. The sun hung low in the sky as the entire village gathered around the open space, still buzzing from the excitement of the competition. The drums had quieted, and the crowd's energy was palpable, like a storm about to break. Eshe stood at the edge of the gathering, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She had just won the festival, outshining everyone, Zalaira, the strongest warriors, and even the villagers who had doubted her. But there was one final thing left to do. It was time to face the truth. With her head held high and her heart steady, Eshe began to walk toward the center of the crowd. Every step was deliberate, powerful, and filled with a newfound strength. She walked with a confidence no one had ever seen in her before. For the first time, her legs didn't tremble. For the first time, she wasn't hiding. As she moved, the villagers parted, their gazes following her every step. Nabinti stood near the front, her face flushed with fury. She had never expected Eshe to rise above her cruelty, and now it was clear. Eshe wasn't the weak girl she thought she could control. When Eshe reached the center, she stopped. The whole village was watching. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Slowly, she pulled up the hem of her dress, revealing her feet. The scars from the broken glass that had once torn them apart were now visible for all to see. Deep, jagged lines marred her skin, a reminder of the pain and torment she had endured at the hands of Nabinti. Gasps echoed through the crowd. No one had ever known the full extent of her suffering. All this time, they had seen her as a quiet, humble servant, unaware of the cruelty that lay beneath the surface. "Look at her feet," one villager whispered. "She has suffered more than we ever knew." Eshe stood tall, her eyes locked on Nabinti, who now looked visibly shaken. The weight of her cruelty was now exposed for everyone to see. "I've walked through pain, through humiliation, through your cruelty," Eshe's voice rang out, strong and clear. "But today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as someone who has overcome, and you will not break me again." Nabinti's face flushed crimson with rage. She stepped forward, trying to regain control, but the words escaped her. She had no excuse, no defense. Everyone could see it now. The village knew who she truly was. Eshe turned her gaze from Nabinti to the villagers. "For years, you saw me as weak. You thought I was nothing, but I was never weak. I was just waiting for my moment to rise. And now, I am stronger than I have ever been." The crowd was silent, but their eyes were full of respect. They could no longer deny what they had witnessed. Eshe was not the girl they had once ignored. She was a woman who had endured unimaginable pain and still stood tall. With one last look at Nabinti, Eshe turned and walked away, her steps confident and steady. The village had seen her strength, her scars, and her resilience. They had witnessed the truth, and there was no going back. As she walked past the crowd, they stepped aside, not out of fear, but in awe. Eshe had walked through the darkness, through the worst of her past, and now she walked into a new future, one where she was no longer defined by the cruelty she had faced, but by the strength she had found within herself. And as Eshe disappeared into the distance, the sound of the crowd's applause rang in her ears. It was not just a victory in the competition, it was a victory over her past, a victory over the person who had tried to break her, a victory that would echo through the village for generations to come. The moment Eshe revealed the truth, the village could no longer pretend. The weight of Nabinti's cruelty hung heavily in the air. The people who once feared her now saw her for what she truly was: manipulative, cold, and heartless. There was no place for someone like that in the village anymore. The village council, which had always been silent in the face of Nabinti's power, now acted. It was time for justice. The elders, their voices firm and clear, decreed that Nabinti would be banished. She would leave the village immediately, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Nabinti's face twisted with disbelief. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "I am the wife of Chief Bahari. I am your leader." But the council was resolute. "You are no longer the wife of the chief. You are a traitor to this village, a coward who hid behind lies and cruelty. Your time here is over." As Nabinti was escorted out of the village, her eyes burned with hatred. She glared at Eshe, her once innocent stepdaughter, now the woman who had exposed her for all to see. But there was nothing Nabinti could do. Her reign of terror had ended. Behind her, Zalaira, her daughter, stood motionless. She had always been her mother's shadow, believing in her lies, in her superiority. But now, she saw the truth. and the truth was a bitter pill to swallow. The villagers, once fearful of her, now looked at Zalira with disdain. She had been complicit in her mother's cruelty, turning a blind eye to Eshe's suffering. Zalira tried to speak, to defend herself, but no one listened. The elders turned their backs on her, and the villagers whispered among themselves. They muttered, she was as bad as her mother. She had the chance to stand up for Eshe, but she didn't. Zalira was shunned, left alone to face the consequences of her own choices. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her with the same respect they once had. The village had turned its back on her, just as it had on her mother. Eshe, now standing tall and unwavering, had become the voice of justice in the village. The girl who had once been oppressed, broken, and silent was now the one who spoke for those who had no voice. She was not just a survivor, she was a leader, a force to be reckoned with. With Mama Jovia's teachings and Elder Omari's wisdom, Eshe had become stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. She had learned that true strength came not from revenge, but from the ability to forgive and to protect others from suffering. Eshe stood before the villagers, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. I will ensure that no one here suffers as I did, she declared. I will stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, and I will bring justice to those who have been silenced. Her words were not just empty promises, they were a vow. Eshe's rise had shown the village that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope, and now she would be the beacon of that hope. From that day forward, no one in the village dared to abuse their power. The weak were no longer invisible, and the strong were held accountable for their actions. Eshe had made sure of it. She became a leader, a protector, and a symbol of resilience. As for Nabinti and Zalira, they were exiled from the village, never to return. Nabinti, her pride and cruelty stripped away, wandered the wilderness, a woman lost to the consequences of her own actions. Zalira, once her mother's heir, now had nothing, no title, no respect, no place. She was left to live with the regret of her choices, knowing that her own greed and apathy had led to her downfall. In the end, karma had dealt its justice, and Eshe had emerged victorious, not just in the festival, but in life. She had walked through the fire, and now she would walk with the wisdom and power to guide others, ensuring that no one would ever have to suffer as she did. Eshe's journey from pain to power is a story that reminds us all of the strength we carry within. Even in our darkest moments, her resilience, her courage, and her unwavering will to rise above cruelty is a beacon of hope for anyone who feels trapped or unseen. When we stand up for ourselves and others, justice is inevitable, and the truth will always come to light. If you've been inspired by Eshe's journey, her strength to overcome, her voice for the silenced, and her victory over her painful past, then don't let this message stop here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to know they're not alone, and that their strength can carry them through anything. Please, like this video if you believe in the power of resilience, and share it with your friends and family. Let's spread this story far and wide. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, strength, and transformation. Together, we can create a community where no one suffers in silence, and everyone's story is heard. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us.